Okay, let's start. Let's start with Eyal Weizman. I think everybody of you knows him, but basically now we are going to have one of the key lecturers of this festival. Eyal Weizman is a professor of spatial and visual cultures at Goldsmiths University of London, and in 2010 he founded the research agency Forensic Architecture, of which now is the director. So welcome to Eyal. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really great. It's really great being back here. I think I was in the last session also, and I think it feels like an ongoing discussion as the issues of that we encounter in forensic architecture are also changing. The focus of the lecture I give here from time to time will do. And I think that today I would like to speak about the phenomena that is otherwise referred to as post-truth and what we as architects have to do with it, and how perhaps in employing the tools and techniques of that we have at our disposal as architects, repurposing them to become investigative tools, we can seek a certain leverage and gain political influence, or at least a kind of a voice in political discussions that are happening worldwide. And I think that you all would agree with me that truth is these days a certain battlefield, which is not to say that opinions about what is right and what is wrong, what happened and what didn't happen, have not been articulated before, but that the political mobilization of truth claims, or perhaps one could say the political attack on truth statements, have such a critical place in the world in which we live. And in particular, although forensic architecture works now across the scale from cases of police violence, urban warfare, environmental destruction, and providing evidence in courts, in other public domain forums, I would like to start today with the smallest of all elements, because I think that sometimes looking at details, architectural details, could have enormous political effect. And I would start with a very small point of identification that forensic architecture was asked to arbitrate upon in April 2017. There were reports that chemical weapons were used by the Syrian government in the Idlib area of Syria, something that had enormous consequences in relation to how we understand that civil war. And there was a wound, there was a small architectural wound in the road that we spent weeks, in fact, looking at. We were doing for Human Rights Watch at the time a three-dimensional analysis of that very small crater in the city of Khan Shakhdun. And as we were working and as we were determining the dimension and confirming there was a chemical strike there, another has in fact occurred in another town just several kilometers to the south called Alatimina. And when that happened, the Syrian and Russians were feeling the heat of critical international attention at their use of chemical warfare. And you would see now one of the chief commanders of the Russian Air Force, in fact, going back to the same evidence that we've produced and trying to discredit us. And he's trying to say that that little crater that we showed in a road is not the consequence of a chemical bomb, And in doing so, he's providing a section, very kind of, all of you architects will be very familiar with, of the chemical bombs that the Syrian employed in order to show it could not be the case. So this is the press conference. You see the board. You see the very same architectural wound. You see all sort of analysis on that. He's explaining why all the determination that that was a result of a chemical strike are wrong, and giving, in fact, the missing link, what we absolutely needed to have and did not have at the time. So denial sometimes could be clumsy enough to provide you very important evidence. We did not know what bombs the Syrians were using until that moment. And when we knew that, we could actually go and start looking for those very things. So here you would see a very simple let's call it a three-dimensional model of that bomb. And now we are starting to work like archaeologists, almost starting to paste together a kind of an old amphora, finding different bits that were sent to us, and with our software, finding their original form. And again, like archaeologists, looking very carefully at the dimensions of fins and all steel elements within that bomb, measuring them, scaling them out, untangling them, and fitting them onto the model that is there. Sometimes it requires enormous patience, and the work of a forensic architect is indeed somewhere between that of the archaeologist pasting together an old clay pot and a kind of a political claim that come with that. And here, the Russians provided the model, and we could find that all the elements that we did not know where they existed and where they belonged before perfectly fit within this drawing. It was an incredible error on their behalf that exposed their entire system as a sham. So this is what we call open verification. We think that today what post-truth is not an argument about what is false and what is right, but is an attack on the science, on the expertise, on the techniques, on the networks of collaboration that buttress truth claim. And indeed, those become very complex and entangled and multidisciplinary, and those that claim the kind of the post-truth reality would always try to cut them apart. And our aim is to use architecture, and I'll show you many more examples in which this has happened, precisely in order to paste together from shards and fragments a kind of a shadow of a truth that could be mobilized politically. As we started with Russia, I think we will continue here with the Russian-Syrian example and look at that kind of what I call the dark epistemology of what later will become the dark epistemology of the extreme right, that attack on truth production that is at the heart of contemporary negation, and how aesthetic practitioners, architects, artists, filmmakers, activists, people on the ground can start resisting and confronting these very statements. So here is another case, perhaps the most important controversy still ongoing till this very day about another chemical strike in Syria, this time in a suburb of Damascus called Douma. This happened on April 2018, a day before this suburb of Damascus was taken by regime forces. A canister, a yellow canister, this one, was photographed on a balcony, on this balcony, and immediately claims and counterclaims whether that was a chemical strike started to come out into the public domain. And the consequences of those were devastating, because the US decided that that was a chemical strike and attacked Syria, attacked an airport in Syria, and I think that you know about this case. We were absolutely against such military intervention, but we wanted to figure out the truth. Was it or wasn't it a chemical strike? Something that, as I say, until today, it is one of the biggest issues to do with the Russian relation with the West. And for us, an opportunity to understand how truth can become a casualty of war and how techniques of media can be manipulated by all sides. So what we see here is a Russian journalist, the first journalist that has arrived on the site. That is the person that first photographed that canister. And what he's saying is that this canister was brought from the ground and placed on this balcony. The debate had a very diagrammatic and simple contours to it. If this canister was dropped from the air, it was only the Syrians and the Russians that controlled the air. So it could only come from a regime or regime-supporting force. If it was brought from the ground, it was the resistance that has brought it. What in those images would let us know whether that canister has come from the air or from the ground? Indeed, what we started to do is a very detailed architectural analysis and looking very carefully at the dimensions and modeling very carefully what it is that we could see. We use architectural model to locate each one of many still frames that we had of this canister so that we could start understanding where the camera is located and what is it that we see in those images. For example, all of a sudden we noticed that here at the top of the balcony, there was a chipping there that indicated for us that, or supported, at least, if not proved, the fact that there was an upward or downward trajectory in which this canister has arrived to that balcony, and we were measuring all those dimensions, etc. We were using a software that allowed us, in a very interesting way. This is a software that is used usually to create those kind of folded architectural environment that you see in parametrics, but it allowed us also to untangle those twisted metals that you see on that roof and to see what exists within this pile of metal. We could see, for example, that if we are taking that twisted piece of metal and untangling it, it gives us a perfect dimension of a balustrade on a roof. And if the balustrade fell again, it started leaning towards the conclusion that the canister came from above, hit the corner of that balcony, took this fence with it on its way to the ground. But there were other elements in it. And sometimes those filming do not know how much information exists within those, seemingly just illustration images. So we see a pile of rubble and we see a pile of twisted metal. But when you start looking at it again with a patience of an archaeologist and start untangling those twisted pieces of metal, you would see, for example, something that we know to be a harness, a twisted harness that has a shape like that when untangled. And we saw previously on many other chemical strikes in Syria that those fins are what is attached to canisters, and we could see that precisely fitting the dimension of this canister. So if it was brought from the ground, a great force would have anyway had to untangle that and take away that piece of metal and put it there. But that was not enough. We needed now to look again, archaeologically almost, at the canister itself. We were using all images that we found to wrap around the size of the canister, which we've taken from, we knew that this canister is a product, and we placed all the images, so almost now tactilely, in a tactile way, we could analyze it and start reading very carefully those things that we see on it. For example, you see the charred surface on the top that, again, doing open source analysis, that is to say, looking at websites and evidence in previous sites, we could see that in other chemical strike, there's always that charred top. We can see a little deformation in there, very important if it was dropped from the air, that the canister would have a deformation within it. And most importantly, and that is what effectively made the proof, is that we saw a very thin imprint of a grid on that image. And that imprint of the grid, we were trying to see if it's exactly the same dimension of the grid on the fence, and we could measure it, and we even saw the way it was woven with some of those lines on top and some at the bottom. Indeed, sometimes a trace left in the dust on an object, when you look at it hard enough, you can start seeing things that are absolutely crucial evidence. As I say, that evidence might seem like small scale, but it had enormous geopolitical consequences. Some of them not really positive from our point of view, like a US attack or US-led attack on Syria. Another thing that we started noticing is drainage, draining signs on the body of the canister. You could see very clearly those threaded lines, and this happens when a chemical weapon discharges high pressure gas inside. It has a condensation on the body that later drain, but draining always happens downwards, and what we see is that the draining goes upward. And this is very disturbing, because we understand in this moment that that evidence has been tampered with, and that the canister has rotated. And at that moment, you understand that what you're looking at is not what you absolutely think you're looking at. Somebody has gone to this canister, touched it, very soon after it hit the ground, and you start realizing that in situations like that, all sides might be tempering, photographing, moving that evidence, and one has to take a kind of a more distant view on that in this respect. So our conclusion was, yes, that was a chemical strike executed by the Syrians, sanctioned by the Russian Air Force, but yes, as the Russians were claiming, the evidence has been tampered with, and possibly also by people on the ground. So this is something that we need to bear in mind when we see those things. Here, a project that is very, very recent. It is to do, again, with some kind of other kind of chemical munition, if you like, but to do with the other type of environment in which forensic architecture is presenting work. As you know, we present work in courts, in parliamentary inquiries, in truth commission, in human rights report, but we also show work in art and cultural forums, such as exhibitions, such as the exhibition here, where forensic architecture has represented the UK and we presented, in fact, evidence that we were working with Iraqi Yazidi communities to gather evidence for the Yazidi genocide perpetrated by ISIS, and that is evidence that hopefully is going to the International Criminal Court. But again, we present also in art and architectural forums, and usually we use exhibitions as places to amplify the reach and audience that can look at our work. But what happened at the Whitney Biennale in just a few months ago, or what started with our invitation to show at the Whitney Biennale a few months ago, and is still ongoing, brought together the human rights world and the art and cultural one together. A story that was broke out on one of the art and politics blogs in New York called Hyperallergic suggested that the deputy head of the board of the Whitney, Warren Kanders, is a weapons dealer and manufactures tear gas and other policing equipment that is used in many places, including in Israel-Palestine, where I come from. And I've checked in my files, in my own photograph, and I've seen that I was breathing his tear gas really since I kind of like matured, let's say, as an activist in this part. So money that was effectively earned selling weapons and munitions was supporting art and cultural program at the Whitney, something that for us brought those two worlds together. So we decided to use our invitation to the Whitney Biennale, change our opinion about what it is that we're going to show there, and effectively show in a museum an investigation of the board, this board member and his company. When we started that investigation, we wanted to know where he is exporting his tear gas. Again, I said we knew it was used in Israel-Palestine. We knew it was used on the Tijuana border, on a caravan. It was fired by American border police on the caravan that was trying to get into the US around Tijuana. But unlike weapon export, the export of policing equipment, and tear gas is a policing product, are not on public record. You only know where a company sells its product when you find photograph of that munition online. To search in the internet for these munitions would take us months, if not years. Simply viewing all the material that exists now is impossible. It is already a well-known fact that there are more hours filmed of for example, of the civil war in Syria than hours fought there. There's more film than actual history of that conflict. So we knew that we needed to use new technology, and in this context, machine learning, it's a feature of artificial intelligence that would scan the internet and identify those munitions manufactured by the deputy head of the board, one of the greatest funders of the Whitney, the person whose money we received in order to exhibit there, and in fact call for accountability. So teaching a computer how to see is almost like teaching, or is analogous perhaps, to teaching a child how to see and how to identify objects. You show the computer thousandth time the same object and you say, that's a tear gas canister, that's a tear gas canister, that is a tear gas canister, in different lighting conditions, in different configuration, with different lenses, in different resolutions, if you like, all of them looking from different angles, obviously, all of them looking a little bit different. You make a mask and show these are triple chasers. You show it from all different permutations. You do it about 10,000 times, and then you can send your machine learning algorithm, unleash it on the internet to start bringing you images that were not found yet. However, we couldn't find 10,000 images of a particular class of that munition called a triple chaser. So what we've done is we wanted to create a synthetic classifier. That is, to use modeling, our ability to model objects and to render them, to create a series of fake images, i.e. simulated images of the canister, tell the algorithm that what it is looking at are real images, and then teaching the machine to identify that munition, and then sending it on the internet to go and fetch these bits. We did manage to get Mikol here, an activist from Mexico, to actually find a triple chaser canister for us. Another one was found for us by a friend of mine, Emily Jassir in Palestine. We could get a dimension and model it from those. And from these, we created the base architectural model that we matched with a catalog dimension, as we could see online, and then initially fit all logos on it, because in different countries, in different situations, different forces have different logos on the triple chaser, on this tear gas canister, and we needed all of them. And then we needed to multiply it and make all the permutation of the different weights, discolors, etc., and throw it randomly in all sort of environment so that we could see how it looks from from many possible perspectives. Initially, creating it and putting it in artificial environment was difficult for the machine learning to actually identify it, because it started identifying things that were not triple chaser, i.e. that tear gas munition, like clouds. We put it in simulated real-world environment. Some of the environments had cloud. We say that's a triple chaser, and he thought the cloud was the tear gas canister. So we started to put it on and against patterned backdrops that we randomly downloaded, so it can start understanding the relationship between figure and ground, and created a series of rendering that were much easier for the computer to identify, again, placing it in all sort of scenarios so that it could start identifying those things. And then within models, we were throwing it randomly so that we would have the different ways it may hit the ground, and also the way in which the sort of the tear gas comes out of the canister itself. Then we were very much interested in what does it mean to make a film that is both for humans to see, because we wanted it to be at the Biennale, but also a film that could teach the machine to see. What is the difference between a machinic audience making a film for the computer or making a film for the human eye, and in what way they could be differently experienced? What we decided to do, we decided that effectively at the end we could only demonstrate it rather than make a film for the computer. But we wanted to put all 10,000 images that teach the computer how to see the tear gas canister in the film in fast succession. And that was creating a problem that the consequence was actually, it was possible that it would create seizure attack on. So here is a warning for you before I show it, that anyone here that is photosensitive or have epileptic tendency, perhaps just close your eyes for the next few minutes, because it's going to be a quick succession of images. But that idea of photosensitivity was very interesting for us, because it is both the photosensitivity of the algorithm to identifying particular classes of objects and human photosensitivity that brought that sequence to the threshold of vision, to the threshold of what could be actually seen. And in fact, if you would take that film and you would feed it to the computer, you would have about a third of the total images that are needed to train the algorithm in that way. So later, obviously, you write a code, you go to, say, YouTube, you put some keywords in there, and it starts scanning the internet, looking itself through hours and hours and hours of footage, and later bringing images and the probability that they contain what it is that you think they contain. Like here, 21% triple chaser, 6% triple chaser. Indeed, it's not yet as tuned as the human eye, but definitely going in the right direction. We could also identify that this very funder, the board member of the Whitney that we were investigating, is also manufacturing bullets that was not known before, and we engaged in open source research in order to tie the bullets that he is manufacturing to Israeli snipers shooting unarmed Palestinian protesters in Gaza, something that the UN referred to as war crimes and potentially also maybe crimes against humanity, that allowed us to use that analysis in a much more radical way. So here you see Israeli soldiers using, when something that was not known before, using the munition manufactured by the Whitney board member to effectively shoot, and they've already killed 150 unarmed protesters there. This is a piece that we've done for the New York Times, where we analyzed a shot, a medic, Rosanna Najjar, who was shot and killed by the fence in Gaza by synchronizing, as you would see, 5 videos. So also, in order to, something that I would like to kind of impress upon you, that in order to see media, in order to consume media today, we need architecture. We need to see the spatial relation between those images. It's not enough to see images by themselves. It is not enough to think about videos through the classic operation of a montage, a linear succession, but through navigation, a spatial kind of viewing that allow us to locate here by the fence in Gaza each and every protester and start modeling the scene in great detail in order to see more or less the relationship between different people, victims and perpetrators, that otherwise, if you just see that video by itself, is very little understood. It needs to be modeled. It needs to be put in relation to other videos that we see. Only in that way, navigating through the architectural model between one video and the next, could we start making sense of what is happening. Here is Rosanna Najjar being shot. She's been shot dead, but from which direction, etc. You can only do it by effectively synchronizing all those images together and establishing a cone of fire that would lead effectively all the way to the border to Israel and the snipers that are employed on the other side there. So again, architecture is an essential visual apparatus that allow us to make sense of those things. Indeed, though, in this case, it allowed us to tell a very complicated story that was not understood previously, of how 3 people were actually shot or impacted by a single bullet that fragmented and skipped from the ground. A certain kind of freak incident that still implied that Israel was shooting towards them, but it skipped over the ground, fragmented, and hit 2 medics before it went on to hit Rosanna Najjar. So this is the complex operation here. Something a bit closer to home. To you, the biggest controversy that is happening now in the Mediterranean, This is a joint work between forensic architecture and forensic oceanography, a kind of a group that started and splintered from us, run by Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pezzani, two former PhD students of mine, who are investigating incidents of the loss of life and of migrants in the Mediterranean. And as you know, one of the biggest controversies right now is that in order to stem migration through the Mediterranean, the Italian government, like other European governments, criminalize those people that save a migrant in distress in the Mediterranean. And instead of saving them, instead of allowing independent group to save them, they commission the Libyan Coast Guard to do the rescue, which does not look at all like a rescue, and bring those sub-Saharan migrants back into Libya, where they are put in camps, sometimes sold. There were reports by Amnesty sold to slavery, etc. And all that is done by Europe as a conscience policy to stem migration. That's what it takes for them to stop that migration. And it's not the government that is now in power that started it. It is already the previous government that was involved. So we are working with NGOs in the Mediterranean. We were very closely working with them to start documenting their work in a precise and systematic way. A particular German NGO called Jungenrettet, Youth Rescues, starting to employ a lot of cameras to document their own activities. But again, simply filming is not enough. You need to be able to put all this material together in a convincing way. So we've developed something that we called visual radar, a way of synchronizing and mapping into space footage from the sea. Here you see Jungenrettet doing a rather routine rescue of migrants. As they perform this rescue, the boat is turning on their axis, and therefore it's recording the horizon. And on the horizon, we start seeing all the other boats that exist. This is the production of a visual radar that allows us to map and allow us to understand what is happening, something that is very essential when the authorities are trying to incriminate those NGOs in being people smugglers. So here is an example of that. June 2017, a rather routine rescue by Jungenrettet on the Juventa boat results in an accusation by the Italian prosecutor that effectively these NGO activists that have already rescued those migrants that came on that wooden boat, they've taken them already into the mother boat. They claim that they dragged that boat back to Libya. That is to say, they're helping smugglers bringing up or bringing more migrants. And that's something that arguably, perhaps not our opinion, could be considered as aiding people smugglers, etc. But what in this image, in the consequence of that accusation, was that the NGO ship was actually confiscated. The NGO is out of the water. They're awaiting trial. We're producing evidence with them. The boat is still stranded in Trapani. It's not doing what it needs to do, and that is to rescue people. And the seas are open to the Libyan Coast Guard to rescue people and take them back to Africa. But what in this image gives us any direction? How the Italian prosecutor can claim that this boat is being dragged towards the Libyan territorial water when there is no indication of direction. There's no sun, there's nothing in it. In fact, there is one indication of direction, and that's the direction of the waves. And you can motion track the waves and start seeing what is the form, effectively, of the water. We have modeled the water and the entire fluid dynamic of it in order to look very carefully at the pattern of waves in relation to the sun, in relation to the wind during that day, and check all possible orientation of the boat. And what you could see very clearly when you compare it to open source meteorological data is that the wind this day would have positioned the boat going, in fact, northward when you actually, sometimes something very small within the image already gives you a very good indication of something that is the opposite, the absolute opposite of what the Italian prosecutor was saying. So we thought, this is an open and shut case. The boat need to be released, but not. Obviously, truth need not be technically mobilized, but need to be argued for. We need the politics, we need the activism, we need multiple platforms, we need forums in order to claim again and again and again that this lie cannot be maintained, that there could not be politics built on that lie of those activists being people smugglers. Here is another case from Syria. We were asked by Amnesty International to research the most notorious prison in Syria, the Sednaya prison, a prison in which people disappeared. Amnesty International claimed that more than 20,000 people might have been executed there, a place where no journalist and no human rights organization have been allowed to see. But Amnesty found 5 witnesses. Those 5 witnesses escaped to Turkey and were willing to speak and were willing to help us reconstruct the architecture of the prison and the events within it. But like very often, memory of witnesses is something that is very complicated when you have traumatized witnesses. And in human rights, often we speak to the most traumatized people who are asked sometimes to very painfully reconstruct the most difficult moments of their lives. And within that, what we have also, the problem in this case was that the witnesses, i.e. the survivors of that prison, entered it being either blindfolded or with sacks on their heads or having to press their hands against their eyes. They've in many cases not even seen the prison, they've only heard the prison. So something that we call operative models, our use, forensic architecture use of models, is to operationalize model in different ways. I've shown you before how we use models like archaeologists. I showed you before how we use models like as a way, as an optics, to make sense of multiple media, to navigate. Here, we use acoustic and architectural modeling in order to aid memory to resurface of people that had no access to the events. And together with them, we built the model of that prison, both acoustically, checking reverberation and echoes, together with a member of our team, Lorenza Buhamdan. We were helping them build, and as the model was being built by the witnesses, memory was being built. There was an entangled process in which memory builds the model was there to be navigated through, which built more memories, and there was a kind of an entangled form of reconstruction that became very effective. Could I have sound, please? Sound?
ايش في تحت على هذا الارتفاع؟
نفس هي الشراقة نفس الشيء اللي سميناه طاقة، شيء تحت بيسموه شراقة.
بقى على قد عرضها؟
So here is an example of how an interview like that might work. We are building an architecture model together with a survivor. We are following very carefully the instruction of that survivor. In this case, we are modeling a hatch in a door. It's very technical, but sometimes memory is attaching itself to those most technical details. The woman speaking to the witness is a Palestinian architect, Hania Jamal, who's a member of our team. And effectively, they're just trying to figure out where the hatch was. and then a repressed memory that was previously not accessed sprang.
عرضها بقدر طلع منها يعني طول وشي أطول من وشي بشعرها.
وهذا ارتفاعها وعرضها بالنسبة للباب يعني هي الباب.
لا هي عرضها، أنا عم بحكي عن عرضها ما عم بحكي. هي الباب تمام.
So they're trying to figure it out. They're drawing, they're looking at the model.
هي عريضة، هي مستطيلة. تمام؟ ليش أكبر بالعرض؟ لأنه أنا هي واحدة من العقوبات اللي تعاقبتها جوا، هي إني يطلع راسي من قلب هي الطاقة ويندعس على راسي. يعني هلا خليني أنا أرسم لك وشي هون. بمرة من المرات نحن اجى السجان طلب قال ليش ما نضيف زنزانتكم؟ لانه نحن ما عندنا مواد، نحن عالم جربانين، نحن ما عندنا مي، نحن ما عندنا اي وسيله لحتى نقدر نضيف زنزانه. قال لي مدرسك. انا ما فهمت. قال لي مدرسك. قلت له من وين؟ قال لي مدرسك من هون. انا قلت لحالي اكذب، قلت له ما بيطلع، هو فعلا راسي بالطول ما بيطلع. قلت له ما بيطلع، قال بالعرض، بيعرف حاله انه بالعرض بيطلع راسي. فعملت هيك، ففعليا انا وقت عملت هيك راسي بالعرض مرق بالعرض يعني وقت صار العرض تبع راسي هو الطول الطبيعي. وبعد ما طلعته بالعرض رجع جلس لي اياه بحيث صارت جوزة حلقي على زيق هي هذا الزيق تبع الشراقة بسموه. أنا صار راسي برا ونط هيك بكل وزنه نط.
So we shouldn't continue because it becomes very gruesome, but effectively something that could not be achieved in a normal conversation has been accessed through a model, i.e. the model becomes also a mnemonic device to connect back into memories. And that was published and was widely circulated. Research we've done, and Assad himself was asked to respond to it, to that report we've made with Amnesty, and this is what he says.
It was a report made by Qatar and financed by Qatar. You don't know the source, you don't know the names of those victims, nothing verified about that report. It was paid by Qatar directly in order to vilify and smear the Syrian.
Okay, we're still waiting for the Qatari money. We're definitely not paid by Qatar. But you could see that sort of the attempt at denial and negation always goes through who are you? Are you qualified as an architect to even render judgment on political issues, on issues of human rights? Who funds you? Are you funded by Qatar? Other people would accuse us, that we are funded by George Soros, something that is now a big sort of attack line of the extreme right when we do work in Eastern Europe and in other places. So in a sense, of course, our work, we are a university-based organization and we are committed only to our fines rather than we do not serve any of the people that pay us. But that's the kind of reality of confrontation in a post-truth environment. Here is an American prison that we were asked to analyze where allegation was that Cameroonian, it was in Cameroon, and that CIA and American intelligence was also present on the site, undertaking also torture of terror suspects within Cameroon. And we were trying to understand whether that was the fact. And effectively looked online, and sometimes we know that Facebook is spying at us. No? We know that all those social media, all the electronics that we have, but sometimes they can become very effective counter espionage devices, especially when people are not careful. So an American service personnel who was there after the American denied being on site, simply forgets to switch off the location tagging on where he was. And we were able to identify it, and we created a model of that prison in order to match each one of his Facebook posts. Chilling, he says, photographs that allowed us to expose the kind of drone technology and surveillance equipment that they're using in this place. You could see that the Americans had access into the heart of this base, actually undeniable evidence that they were in there, posting images within that. We could see that the base is actually being expanded, that more work is being done there, something that we made public immediately and kind of analyzed as part of the American military expansion in Central Africa. And, this here, you would see a rather, what's happening? A rather comical video of American soldiers and Cameroonian soldiers playing football with night goggles, obviously training for night goggle equipment. And we could see that where we spotted American service personnel, where we saw their images, where we knew torture and detention is taking place, is effectively the same site. Now, I don't know, is there somebody going to give me a sign if I'm going over time, or should I just simply continue? Are we done? Lorenza? I have more.
I think it might be interesting also to get questions from the public.
I have about 30 more cases I wanted to show today. So. Okay, let's close it. Okay.
Joseph, let's start with your question.
So I'm sorry I wasn't here to introduce you, but at least I can be here for your exit. And,
it's wonderful to see you anyway.
Likewise. No, it was, I think, one question also to kind of bring this back to the context of Arc Week and really thinking about the future of architecture, the future of cities, the future of agency in this sense as designers in relation to your work. And I think the amazing thing about your work is that you've been able to really take a set of skills and specialisms and ideas and really operate a kind of a translation into a completely separate field that in a way seems obvious after you've done it, but in a way that was really the turning point of your work, was to introduce the idea that architecture can be relevant out in a completely different context that really, I think very few others have gone so far in proving. And I was wondering whether at this point, having also kind of completed, I guess, over a decade now of work in this sense, whether in any way some sort of idea about how this could feed back into the design act, into the sort of creative process. Because I think that's something that kind of off the top of one's head one can give a number of very trivial answers to, but in fact the reality is much deeper, and of course it's not about kind of a sort of how can I say, liberal version of the securitization of cities or the sort of militarization of space and the kind of sort of peaceization of space. But is there, and it has this, I'm sure it's something you've thought about, how the architectural practice could be affected by your work?
Thank you. I think this is something that we are continuously thinking about and in fact trying to answer in multiple ways. Firstly, our work is not simply about clarifying past issues that are not relevant. Our work, if we examine a case, and right now we can choose, we get, we run about 10 projects at the same time, the office has grown, we work both in courts, for the UN, for all the human rights organizations, for activist groups, social movements, etc. Our principle of taking a commission is that clarification could create material change. For example, we were working for many years now with a particular community in the Israeli desert, in the Nakab or Negev desert. We have exposed police violence there. We exposed police lies. We kind of got some egg on the faces of the authorities in relation to that. But the aim, in fact, was the maintenance of that village in its place and an ongoing life in there rather than simply passing judgment on something that would not have spatial consequences on the future. So this is one thing that's very obvious, no? I mean, these are living cases, these are ongoing conflicts. We aim towards the future when we clarify things. Second is, as architects, we are trained, and sometimes in a very simplified way, to do analysis, to learn about a site or a situation, where it's a country far or near, or a city here, or countryside, or and that becomes our site of intervention, right? So we learn about a place in order to know how to intervene in it. For us, we want to cut that relation between gathering knowledge about a particular site and intervention there. For example, we are involved now in the design of forums in which debate is undertaken. So the introduction of our techniques, the acceptance of our technique, now to International Criminal Court. So we are advisors now to the International Criminal Court, or we are on the advisory board for the use of new technology. The introduction of new technology into the court would mean the design of a completely different set of spatial mediatic relation, if you like, within them. Sometimes there is no court to arbitrate over cases that we expose. Sometimes we need to actually build the physical forums in which clarification would take place. And it's important to remember that forensics comes from the word forum. Forensics is the art of the forum. And the art of the forum, in fact, is the art of the creation of a public space. And public space is public space because you debate things within it. And sometimes around those pieces of evidence that we produce, we need to create the kind of technological, mediatic, social spaces in which they would happen. And we were involved in the conception of several ones of those. Of course, we are not, we're not engaged in kind of community architecture to become more resilient to bomb or something like that. And I'm sure you're not asking on that level, because we do not think that there are architectural design solutions on the scale of architecture to those geopolitical questions.
I think we have very short time. I think there is Raul from Orbs that has a question.
That was a great presentation, and there was a kind of hypnotic quality to a lot of your visuals. You were reminded of old narratives, storytelling strategies in which forensics provide the great sort of concluding finale in courtrooms, in stories, and there was a similar quality. And then you also brought in the notion of space, but space was also seen as context. And then I just wanted to ask you a question about whether you can broaden the narrative of context to locate the notion of justice, which ultimately is your final sort of platform, because there is also the entire narrative of showing and exposing and telling you about the truth ultimately has to move ahead. And in the context where justice is, itself not really, the location of justice is so vague, globally. There is no real center where one can, in spite of the international justice spaces, and in spite of the fact that in forums like this, we can actually bring out these narratives, we can talk about these exposés, but a lot of us know that today the lie has really replaced the truth. It's not about factions, it's not about fictions. There's something else happening. So how do we actually not feel so helpless after watching this very hypnotic presentation, seeing how much forensics has, of course, played a very powerful tool. But then there is still the final question of what are those platforms of justice? If you talk about space as context, and there's a wider context we need to talk about also.
This is absolutely an essential question, because we are not naive about the limitation of the public sphere. We experience on our flesh every day the reality of negation and denial. But we will never give up on that, because I would not accept the statement that the truth doesn't matter anymore. So simply because some fascist somewhere says that this crowd is bigger than that, does not mean that we need to accept it. And in fact means sharpens the battlefield around particular statements of fact. But rather than think about the traditional forms of truth production, universities, courtrooms, those big temples of truth, we need to think about verification. You know, veritas and verification come from the very same source. Veritas is a kind of a transcendent truth as an almost theological category. Verification is a truth as a practice. It's about relation between communities. It's about empowering citizen-produced data. It is about multiplying the forums in which statements could be debated. And most importantly, it's about confronting those in power with the consequences of their lies. So perhaps a better way to call our agency is not a forensic agency, but a counter-forensic agency, because we only confront states with a violation. We never work for states, we never work for the police, although we were asked many, many times to train and work and explain to state institutions. We keep a kind of firm antagonistic position to states. And most importantly is how you tell your story. What is extremely important is how you weave the world around a detail. How, it's not enough to say, okay, that canister came from the air or from the ground. It is from this canister and what you see imprinted on it that you need to reconstruct slowly in ever-increasing circles the force fields of this war in Syria that is not only a civil war, it's a colonial war at the same time. It is massive international intervention that is there. And somehow all these forces exist also within those details. I'll give you another example. We are working on police violence cases now in the US. Sometimes you need to arbitrate on a split-second decision. You would say, was that policeman right to draw their gun and shoot a motorist, usually a black motorist, and say, I felt threatened, it was a split-second decision. Sometimes we check, we enter into the split second and we measure it. But in order to make political sense of it, you need to place this policeman, the car, and the gun in the world in which they are part. You need to be able to navigate outwards of this case and make sure that we understand, and I think us architects are very good at that, understanding that sometimes details have geopolitical force.
Unfortunately, we have to finish here because there is the next lecture. Thank you very much, Eyal.